This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it, and that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders, today I'm honored to have Eric Müller on the show. He is the VP of Engineering and CISO at Presence, where he leads, engineering teams, and he's got a passion for empathetic leadership and team building. So, just like, the way I am as well, which is going to be pretty awesome for this conversation. Anyway, Eric, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, if you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background, how you got into tech and security, and just what you're doing now.
Yeah. So I've been doing this a couple of years. It's probably a good thing that there's no video here. I definitely have a few gray hairs. I actually, I think like a lot of folks of my generation, I think, and actually of all generations, I very early on, I definitely had that interest in some of the geekier things in life. So, science fiction, role-playing games, spend some time, more than a few years running around Renaissance fairs. I, in some ways, I sort of fell into this, right? So in high school, I studied a bunch of different things, photography, architecture, stuff like that. But I just kept coming back to computers. So, got to college, started studying a mixture of photography, computers, and got a job. They were looking, at this position. I was at Wells Fargo Bank at the time, and they were basically looking for someone to move in and start working on some development work. I was working in HR, kind of as a, to get me through college. And I was like, sure, I'll make the jump over there. And right around that time, as I started getting into programming professionally, this whole web thing took off. And I was like, well, I don't need to finish college. This is really cool. I'm figuring it out as I'm going along. And so I dropped out, started contracting, and then started working for a series of agencies. So I worked at, I've worked at Razorfish, I've worked at Edelman, I worked at Mekanism, ultimately ended up at Presence. I've been here about 11 years. And, there's been this kind of consistent thread through all that, which is, wanting to explore new things, try out new things. And I think the thing that's really cool about the agency world is the fact that, every 6 months, it's a new project. There's new technology. I'm working very closely with new clients. And even though I'm not programming nearly as much as I used to, I still feel like I am close enough to the technology that I can have intelligent, thoughtful, smart conversations with folks.
Awesome. I think that's a trend that a lot of us engineering leaders become, where we kind of just slowly move into the building of people and building of leaders, and we kind of step back a little bit from the deep technology pieces.
Yeah. And I think I agree with that. And I think I've been really lucky. I've had a couple of fantastic mentors. Although at the time I didn't realize they were mentors. It's only looking back. I had one person, I can't get into the details, unfortunately, but he basically put himself on the line to protect an employee. And that's always just had an impact on me. And then there's another gentleman by the name of Ron Lichty, who probably one of the most empathetic leaders I've ever seen. He, he's very thoughtful. He talks to people, helps them solve their problems, make sure they're successful. And he was a manager of mine for a while. And both of these gentlemen, they really just, the fact that I can look back 20 years later and still kind of point to these two men as the folks who kind of brought something to me, I think is really important. And I think it's great, as technical leaders, that we can celebrate people that we mentored and then or that mentored us. and then hopefully we can mentor folks in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And we mentioned you didn't realize they were mentors at the time. I found that's very common. That a lot of people will build a relationship with like a boss or a leader at their company, and get a lot of benefit and learn a lot from that person, and not realize that they're being mentored along the way. Do you see that as a common thing?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that before, and I'm thinking about when I first started as a technology leader, some of the mistakes I made, and I felt like I really needed to do something. Right. So like if someone approached me and said that they're having a problem with, they're having a problem with a client or a coworker or, the design team or something like that. So they'd show up and they'd talk to me about the situation. And then I immediately felt like, well, I'm going to mentor. I'm going to be a manager. I'm going to take care of them. And so I went off and I wanted to have phone calls and do all that kind of stuff. And I realized that's absolutely not the thing to do. Right. It's like, I figured out along the way that most people are smart enough and capable enough of solving their own problems. What they're looking for is a sounding board. They're looking for someone that will listen to the problem and not do anything. Right. And that I think I realized when I look back at the folks that I feel mentored me, that's what they did. They were there. They were there when they needed to be, and they didn't do anything that they didn't need to do. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important thing. And, you mentioned Ron Lichty, and I've had him on the show actually about 20 years ago. Yeah, when he wrote a book called Managing the Unmanageable.
I'm in that book, actually.
I was going to say, are you the unmanageable?
I would say that I definitely was at the time, but that he asked me, that's amazing. Well,
it's a small world. One of the things that I've only had one really formal mentor, or the other mentors are kind of just like people that I met along the way that, out of the goodness of their heart, help grow me as a leader or as a person, and help me learn things that I really needed to learn. And I think a lot of those relationships kind of just naturally evolve that way.
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of being able to build the relationship with other folks is building the relationship with yourself. Mm-hmm. I'm very bluntly, I'm a big advocate for folks, to, if you need some therapy, get that therapy, right? Because you need to figure out who you are first.
Yeah.
Right. Like, how can I help someone grow if I don't know how to grow myself? How can I be empathetic to another person if I'm not empathetic to myself? Right. And I think once you start to figure out who you are, not as a leader, but as a person, then you become, you're vulnerable to yourself, and then you're empathetic to yourself, you're supportive of yourself, you're generous to yourself, and then you can have that same attitude towards the folks that you're working with. Mm-hmm. You can support them, you can defend them, you can be generous to them when they need that generosity. You can help identify places where they need to grow when they need to grow, and enough to get out of the way when you need to get out of the way. And I think as a leader, it starts with you. You have to find yourself first.
Yeah, I love that. And, you mentioned therapy. And one of the things, like, I'd say, 90% of companies out there offer some type of EAP program, employee assistance program. And I participate in that whether I need it or not. Like, every year, it's like, I always start, a conversation with whoever they, pair me up with. Counselor or whatever. I always just say, this is use it or lose it. I'm going to use it because I feel like it's a mental health, checkup, something that I can do just to help myself. And it gives me a lot of insight, a lot of things that, you don't see when you look in the mirror, but if you have someone that can kind of point those things out, you can start to, have a better self-awareness of things that you're doing to help you grow as a person and as a leader, and to find yourself, like you're saying.
Yeah, and I don't even think it needs to be a therapist. I mean, I obviously I'm a fan of that, but I think it could be, your partner, someone who you can be vulnerable with, that you can have those open conversations. I think is really important. And then within the bounds of work, if there's someone, if you're lucky enough to be on a leadership team, if you're not the sole person at the top, it's really nice to have folks that you can bounce ideas off of. I think that's a part of that's another thing, I guess, as I reflect on it, that as a leader, I had to figure out that it's not entirely on me, right? That it is okay to, not only okay, but encouraged to talk to other people, bounce the ideas off of, like, no person is an island, right? And no one is able to do it all on their own. And I think we do our best work when we're able to collaborate with someone, professionally and personally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an extremely important thing. And a lot of new leaders, I think, feel a little bit insecure about going and asking for help and bouncing ideas off their team because they have to show that, or they feel like they have to show that, I have all the answers type mentality, which is totally not true and totally false. And what I found is being vulnerable with your team and letting them know the things that you need help with and the things that you want their opinions on shows that you trust them. It builds transparency and just builds that, central teamwork kind of mentality. So one of the things I did, you hit on a term that I want to ask you about is generosity. And I haven't heard a whole lot of people talk about generosity when it comes to leadership. But I think when you said that, I started thinking about the ways that a leader can be generous to their team. And, obviously people think of financially, but that's not really, I don't think that's really what you're talking about when you said that, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, and I think that, money's the easy part. And I think, there's all the studies that show you get to a certain amount of remuneration and it doesn't make any difference in the quality of the job anymore. So I think when I'm talking about generosity is it's like assuming the best, right? And, I think one of the hardest things is like if something happens, let's say that you have someone comes in, I'm going to go back all the way to, I think one of the best examples of this, I don't want to use the CloudStork. I want to go back to the AWS. They had a big outage in US East 1 about about a decade ago?
When all the DNS things got messed up.
Yeah, and it had something to do with someone had run a script inside of, an S3 bucket somewhere, and everything was screwed. And, the internet was down for 12 hours, right? And, an ungenerous manager, an ungenerous leader would immediately figure out who to throw under the bus. Mm-hmm. They'd be angry, they'd deflect, and someone would be in trouble. And I'm sure there was stress and stuff like that. But I remember the way AWS talked about it. The release was like, look, we screwed up. It wasn't on one person. We have figured out how to fix this and it won't happen again. And so I think that I can imagine that conversation with this manager basically going to the person who ultimately ran that script and say to them, look, this isn't on you, right? I assumed you were doing the best job you could given the information you had. I'm not assuming malicious intent, and so let's work through this together. And so when you start having that idea that people aren't being malicious, that they make mistakes, they want to learn from those mistakes so that they can grow and not make those mistakes again, that's the generosity I'm talking about. Or the generosity of assuming that, people have bad days in their lives. A family member has died. They are going through some financial struggles and things like that. And so you give them space to make some mistakes and help them grow and get to that next place, right?
Yeah.
It's not always being looking for trouble and being angry with people. That's the opposite of what you want to do.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. Now, and when you're talking about people and realizing that they're people and they have, a life outside of work that also affects them one way or another, there's no way to really separate that. You never know what someone's going through that day. You don't know what their morning was like. You don't know what their evening was like unless they tell you, But, we can try our best to be empathetic and learn what those are. But you have to realize that you have to give someone or people grace and understanding that you don't know what they came into, and to approach things with curiosity instead of, condemning them of like, oh, you screwed this up today, saying like, are you okay? What's going on? And trying to understand and be generous, like you said, with your time and with everything else that you're offering to try to figure out what that person is going through and help them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, all this stuff, unless we're on a team of like 3 people, there's a lot of people I'm even going to make it so if you are your team, the responsibility is all on your shoulders, right? But the more people involved, the more the responsibility is shared out, right? And so it's too easy to point a finger at someone. It becomes, the generosity starts to come in at that point where it's like, okay, how did we as a team fail here? How can we as a team learn from the situation? How can we as a team grow? And that generosity, you're immediately like, we're pulling everyone in, we're being kind to each other, we're going to work together, we're going to take the time, like you said, be generous with the time. Having that attitude, I think, is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So empathy is one of those things that I have to consciously like think about and focus on, because I just get caught up in the daily work, and and I won't think about it and won't think about the person. And I don't know if it's just the way I built or how I was managed when I was younger. I really don't know what it is. But one of the things that I found that kind of helped me is before I have like a one-on-one with someone on my team, I always schedule them about at least 30 minutes apart, so I have time to decompress from one and prepare for the other. And in that preparation, 15 minutes or so before it starts, I try to think about like that person and what their life's like. So I'll think about somebody and I'll say their name, and I'll think about, okay, well, they're married, they have 3 kids, their kids are younger. I know that the person takes their child to school in the morning, so they're probably dealing with traffic. They're probably frustrated. Maybe their kid like forgot his shoes, like my kid does sometimes to school and have to go back. And I try to put myself in those situations to get myself in that mindset so I can be more empathetic with the person. Do you know of any other things that we can do maybe in the moment to help encourage empathy?
It's interesting because I don't. That's interesting. I'm gonna not answer your question directly. I don't necessarily know a lot about the personal lives of the folks that I work with. Mm-hmm. I really respect that you do. And there are some folks I know a lot about their lives, but some folks I don't, right? So I don't want to make it seem like I'm this cold automaton. I think that for me, when I hear that, there's an interesting balancing act. God, you're really making me think through this. This is back to me. I think the empathy, feedback. I'm now going to answer your question. I think the empathy for me ultimately is about listening to people, right? And the reason I know some things about some people's lives is because they decide in that moment that there's something they need to share with me to help me understand where they're at, right? And talking with you, I mean, this is the first time we've talked, but I can imagine the people that you work with doing that with you. Mm-hmm. Right? Like for whatever reason, they feel like they do want to talk about their kids. They do want to talk about their family. And I have folks like that on my team. There's other folks like they never want to talk about that stuff. And I honor that. Mm-hmm. Like I've never really thought about that, but I've honored that. And I really resented managers who would pry into my personal life. It's really none of your damn business. I used to work, I used to go to Burning Man. I went about 13, 14 years, and I was working at Schwab at the time. And, that is not a company in the early 2000s, the aughts, where the people would appreciate that I was going to Burning Man, right? And so I never talked about that part of my life, right? And that was important to me. And I had a manager at the time who didn't pry, and I respected him for that. And gosh, that's just fascinating. So I think the empathy, I think what I'm coming back to is this idea of like being there and listening and really listening, right? So if someone talks to you about what their kids are doing, if they want to share that with you, you need to honor that. You need to respect that. Not everyone wants to do that. And you should be listening, and you should be able, you don't want to have a conversation with them 3 or 4 weeks later saying, hey, do you have any kids? When they, like 3 or 4 weeks ago, they told you they did.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Listening is the most important thing, and realizing that some people want to share and some people don't. And building those relationships where people are comfortable telling you one way or the other, and you're right, respecting them enough to listen, because a lot of times people don't listen because they don't have respect for what you're saying. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can tell when someone is like looking at their email, or they're checking their calendar, or they're typing in Slack or something like that. It's like, when you're talking to your team members, particularly in this remote world, you should have only one screen open. Right? And maybe 2. If you want to take notes, fine, do that. But you should have one screen open, and you should be paying attention to that one screen. And you know what? If something distracts you, if a crisis comes up or something like that, you need to trust your team member enough to say to them, "Hey, I'm so sorry. Someone just faxed me. It's a crisis. I apologize." Right? Yeah. You need to have the strength and the trust to be willing to do that. They need to know that you're paying attention to them, that you're listening to them, that you are respecting their time. Right? If you're not going to pay attention to them during that 30 minutes, don't have that 30-minute conversation. Just move on.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I do all my one-on-ones in person because I find myself getting so distracted.
Yeah.
And I like to do it where I like to do walking one-on-ones if it's not too hot. And sometimes in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the summer, it's very hot. But I prefer to do walking one-on-one so that we're kind of, outside in nature, side by side, not sitting in front of my desk or somewhere where it's somewhat intimidating, and we can just have a conversation and talk about whatever. But you're right. If they do come in my office, I shut my laptop because I cannot, I make sure my phone's not even sitting on my desk. It's just put away. My laptop is shut, so I'm not going to get distracted. Otherwise, I will. I'm weak.
Yeah, it is hard. And I get that. I think, at the same time, like, unfortunately, like, I am in that remote world, so I work with folks in Europe and in Latin America and all over the United States. And so I think it's too easy to not pay attention. And so I think, I think we need to, as leaders, we need to force ourselves to do that. And, not everyone wants a weekly 30 minutes with you. I think that's the other part of it. It's like some folks, the rhythm is like 3 weeks. And so I think figuring out what your people need, I think is a part of that, kind of being empathetic. It's not listening to conversations, but figuring out what they need and being there for them when they need that. And, if they don't want to meet with you once a week, that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're 100% right. Because I have people that I meet with, every week, and then other people that we don't have anything scheduled. But we always know that we can come talk to each other, and we tend to talk to each other every week, but we don't have it, a formal one-on-one because that relationship didn't warrant that.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So, when it comes to team building and building a strong team, what are some of the things that you do or have done in the past to kind of, get people to work well together?
There's a couple of things. First of all, one of the biggest thing for me is that it is a 40-hour work week. Mm-hmm. So, and it's not just, because of the labor laws. Harvard Business Review came out with a study a couple of years ago that said, look, anything after 40 hours a week, you get diminishing returns. And so in my mind, it's like after 40 hours a week, you're writing bugs, and you need to spend the equivalent amount of time on Monday morning fixing those bugs. And so you're already behind. You start the next week behind. So I get it that there are times that a team needs to put in some crunch time. That's the reality of what we do. But if crunch time is at the end of every sprint, we have a management problem, not a debate problem. And so right away, by doing that, I'm taking away this massive amount of stress that shows up. If people know that they can show up consistently, work the 40-hour work week, they're not feeling stressed anymore. And so it's easier for them to start to work together. And that's the second thing is I encourage people to pair up, but I don't require it all the time, right? So like if I have the team working on, a problem, I might get the whole team together. We'll mob on the problem, solve it, and then everyone can kind of drift apart. And, kind of do their thing for the rest of the day. And I think that's really valuable, particularly in a distributed team, that you have those extended periods of time where people are working together so that they can have conversations and they can get to know each other. I mean, I know, the first 15 minutes is like, hey, what'd you do over the weekend? All that. I love it when people do that because then they get to know each other. I love Slack used properly as a way to kind of build teams. So I encourage people to use Slack on my team. I also encourage them to turn off that stupid knock sound and to get rid of all the alerts and stuff like that. Slack is designed to distract you. And so I don't want people distracted. but I do want them to have a communication channel. Slack is great for that once you get past the distractions. I also encourage people or discourage people, depending on how you look at it, to I don't want people using private channels, a lot of DMs to talk about things that are probably better in a larger channel. Right. And the reason I do that is, one, it's really easy if you're talking about a problem and you're DMing each other. It's really easy to you're forming a little clique with you and maybe one or two other people. And then it starts to become easier to, maybe say something insulting or disparaging about another team member. So that's a problem. I like to nip that in the bud before it happens. And the other thing is that if you're having a conversation about a problem within the code base or whatever within the project, and it's in a public channel, it's in a thread, but in a public channel, someone else can weigh in.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
So you get people, it encourages people to start to communicate that way, very casually. It's almost water cooling. And then the other thing that I really like is the daily stand-up. Mm-hmm. And I get it. You're supposed to come in. What do you work on? What are you working on? What are your blockers? We're done in 5 minutes. Okay, let's move on. I am more likely to schedule 30 minutes, even if a stand-up only takes 5, 10, 15. Because what I find is everyone shows up, particularly on a Monday. How was your weekend? What'd you do? Like, it's that water cooler moment again, where people are getting to casually chat and we're seeing each other. And I don't require people to have cameras on, in Slack or Zoom meetings. I encourage it, but I don't require it. But I often find like people are more likely to have their cameras on Monday morning. Right, they're back, they're refreshed. Hopefully they had a good weekend. They're ready to start the day off right. And so there's this moment, I think, where people are connecting. And so I think those things I feel like are really important to kind of like drive that sense of team cohesion.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I love that you're kind of recreating the water cooler moment, digitally or virtually, since you don't have that serendipity of being in the same building to where people just kind of run into each other and have those conversations. And another thing I really like that you said was the, using public channels instead of DM. And that's one of the things that I try to encourage as well, because, people will ask, but a lot of times they ask the wrong person. They send like a direct message about, a system problem or a database problem, but there's many people that work on this system and many people that work on this database. So put it out there because someone else may have, done something or heard something or been involved that they can chime in. And you're right. You're, taking away the opportunity for someone else to help.
Yeah. And I think also I've seen things where what's really frustrating for me is like, 2 or 3 people have a DM. So they don't even start a channel. They start a DM with the 3 of them and they start talking about whatever it is. And then they want to pull me in or someone else in. And then all of that previous conversation was lost, right? Because they start a new channel. They start a new conversation. And it's like, now you have to spend 10 minutes catching the person up when they could have read what was already typed. And it's always a summary and a bunch of nuances lost and a bunch of questions are asked. And so I think if you have that from the get-go in a thread, right? So I'm very clear about this. It's like, if you want to have a conversation with another person about the project, but you don't want to flood the channel, start a thread and then you can pull a person into the thread and they can catch themselves up and then continue in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really important when it comes to kind of just building that, that teamwork and a team relationship of not have, and also, like you said, having to catch people up always, every time I have to do it when someone, I have to bring someone else in, I almost like roll my eyes because I hate doing it. I hate reiterating the things that I've already talked about. It's such a inefficient way of working.
Yeah.
So what are some other things that you found that are just kind of like, and are really practical, easy to do things that leaders that are listening can start doing tomorrow when it comes to building teamwork and building relationships with the people on their team?
Oh, I mean, I'd say the stuff that I was talking about with the stand-ups. I think with I think leveraging Slack is really important. I think if you have an opportunity to get folks together, if you're a remote company, if you can get folks together, maybe once a year or something like that, I think that's really valuable. I think with when you're building software, I think having mobbing sessions is really important for building the kind of that teamwork and that cohesion. And what I mean by a mobbing session is, let's say we just did this on a project I'm on like about a week or two ago, and we needed to decide what all the API endpoints were going to be to support a particular page. So we got everyone together, and we basically we didn't define all the contracts, but we basically defined all the routes we needed. We defined, what widgets were going to look like, and we started writing high level some of the API contracts, what the calls are going to look like and what was going to be returned. And that moment together, there was a little bit of heat. We were kind of arguing about stuff. Do we want to combine some things together? Do we want to be, overly broad? All those kinds of things I felt like really brought the team together because we were in it. Right. And I think when you can find those moments of where the team is actually working together and solving a problem, it really helps build that cohesion together.
Yeah, absolutely. Eric, this has been a great conversation. How can people connect with you online or ask questions if they have any questions about the things we've been talking about?
I hate social media, so I'm nowhere to be found except for on LinkedIn. So you can find me. It's Eric Müller at LinkedIn, or it's LinkedIn / blah, 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 Eric Müller. And I'm in California, San Francisco, company's president, so easy to find me that way. And, happy to chat with people if they want to reach out to me.
Awesome. And I'll link that in the show notes too, to geeklydoor.com, so people can click through and find your LinkedIn there. Thanks so much for coming on the show and having this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, John.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geeklydoor.com to learn more about what this guest is up to, click on their links, and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geeklydoor.com/tip.